And speaking of wanting all the money, I wanted to get your take on the Apple Patreon thing. We mentioned this very briefly.
Money,
Yes,
who wants all the money?
it's Apple.
That was not a jingle.
No,
That was us singing on a podcast.
It's just us singing. That's a different thing. That's a single.
Yeah.
So, just a quick disclosure about the thing. We both work with Memberful. Memberful is owned by Patreon. I just think that's worth mentioning.
Relay FM, Incomparable, Six Colors are all Memberful plans.
Yeah, and they've also been sponsored on the shows before. We've had Memberful as a sponsor. So we mentioned this very briefly on the show last week because it happened. It broke last Monday, but it was too big a thing for us to really think about and digest. And I gave a lot of my own thoughts about this Unconnected last week, but I wanted to know your take. So essentially, Apple is requiring Patreon to give them a cut of all memberships that are started in the Patreon iOS app from November. This does not count any existing payments or memberships. So like if somebody signed up in the iOS app today, Apple's not going to get any money from that person. It is 30% of all iOS-only signups from November of this year onwards.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about this?
It's also, they used to have a thing where if you didn't post a thing during a span, you didn't get charged, and that is not possible with this scenario either.
Yes.
I mean, I don't like this. I think that there are a couple ways to look at this. And one is, what is Apple doing? Because I've heard there have definitely been threads about this. What is Apple's policy about having to offer in-app purchases? Because I've also heard from people who've developed apps where Apple said, no, this is based on buying something outside. And even if you don't tell anybody it exists, it doesn't matter. You need to also make it available for in-app purchase.
Apple's rules for the App Store is if you offer a purchase, you must also offer in-app purchase. So like if someone can buy your thing on the web and it's like a digital good, they want you to offer it also in your app and also offer an in-app purchase for it.
Yeah. It's just... And I think that's ridiculous. So it doesn't, there's a bunch of things going on here. First off, I don't actually do any Patreon in the in-app purchase. It makes me think, was it John Gruber who said this? Somebody said they should just shut off their iOS app and use the web. I use the web for Patreon and it's fine. But
clearly it's important to their business, right? Like the iOS app must be important to Patreon or they would have just gotten rid of it.
It lets creators put push notifications into iPhones. Like I get
there are actually like community stuff in it. Like people can have like group chats instead of like a Discord.
I don't. So things I don't like. I don't like Apple saying if you have an app, you have to offer in-app purchases. Especially since you have to offer in-app purchases and pretend that you don't know where else people can buy this thing because it's against the rules. That I think is just fundamentally not great. But I also think that this is Apple trying to insert itself in a product that already has a middleman. So it's trying to invalidate Patreon's business model like it made it impossible for Amazon to, or Comixology for that matter, right, to sell in app. Mm-hmm. Because that means two middlemen, they're both taking their cut. It can't pencil out. It doesn't work that way. And so they can't do it. Not great. And the whole idea of the creators being taxed for this, like one of the problems is because Patreon rolls everything together into a single account and then pays creators, they're not eligible for the small business plan, even though almost all their creators are. So it's a 30% cut instead of 15%. So that's the top of it. It seems to be misguided in the sense that people creating art is not something that Apple should actually take a cut of, I think. Mm-hmm. I think it makes the optics, it makes Apple look bad, but I think also it doesn't really make a lot of sense for them to do it this way.
It doesn't pass the sniff test for logic, like in a bunch of ways.
Yeah. And I think also this is a great example. I mean, first off, it's Apple's one-size-fits-all approach here, which is Apple doesn't think about the creators at Patreon. Apple thinks about Patreon. Apple is focused on taking its cut from this company called Patreon that's making a lot of money. Apple wants its cut. Not thinking about the fact at least not aggressively thinking about the fact that Patreon is actually a middleman, a facilitator for a bunch of individual independent creators.
Yeah, but you're just brainless. If you know what I mean. Like I know what you're saying, but that is like such. And I agree with you.
Oh yeah,
but it's a brainless thought.
This
right?
is what I'm saying. Is you're looking at it in this certain way because you've decided that that's how you're going to look at the world, even though this very clearly isn't that kind of thing. But they've decided, it's like, I'm sorry. And it's that same thing, right? Which is, I'm sorry, our hands are tied. These are the rules. It's like, you made the rules. You make the rules. Your hands are not tied. You made the rules. So what are you doing here? And in the end, just stepping back, what does it look like? It is Apple muscling into a whole bunch of independent creators who make a small amount of money on the internet and saying, hey, we want our money. And it's like, why do you want the money? Patreon's doing all the work. Patreon built our app for us. Patreon's doing the back end. We're cutting in Patreon. What has Apple given us? And Apple's response is, well, we built the platform that the Patreon app runs on. And it's like, well, okay.
Congratulations.
So why aren't you entitled to a portion of what Patreon takes from us?
Yeah.
Why are you entitled to 30% of what people are giving to me as an independent creator? It just looks bad. It doesn't pass the sniff test. You're absolutely right. And, again, this is actually an easy one. This is a great example of Apple playing by a playbook from when they were down on their luck and desperate for money, and now they're rich, and they're still playing by that playbook.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes them look bad. It is, I would say it's probably as harmful, it's probably as bad a look as the hydraulic press ad was, but it's actually actual harm.
They're actually
being done to
doing the
people.
thing that people were upset about that
Yes.
time. They're
Right.
actually
it
doing
is
it with this.
Patreon creators in the hydraulic press now.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Where like that was just an interpretation before. I had a thought about this and like looking through Patreon's rules and it clarified something to me which I feel like I'm gonna keep talking about now, so people aren't going to hit us a lot. Like Apple are perfectly happy with their customers paying more for digital goods than everybody else, because they have zero problem with you putting the 30% on top.
Yeah. And the argument is, if it's so easy to do an in-app purchase, then you pay extra for it. If it makes it super easy. Like, okay. Like, all right. I mean, I think that my frustration with Apple's in-app purchase thing is they don't want to compete.
Yeah.
They want to hide and have this 30% and not compete, and maybe have to lower their take in order to make it. But like, as a platform owner who has built-in payment systems that are just right there in their APIs and everything like that, should Apple offer that and take a cut and say, look, we made it really easy for you. Just give us our cut and it's all built in and it's using their existing credit card and you don't have to worry about it. Like, that's not an unreasonable proposition. It's all the other stuff that's been built around it, which is you can't tell people about the other things. You can't link to the other things. There are no other alternatives if you're in our store unless you're in the EU. This is your only choice. It's 30%. That's the total number. We have very specific rules about it, and you are covered under it, so everybody is going to be covered under it. That's where it all goes from being not an unreasonable argument about Apple's convenience, the convenience of in-app purchases, to being more like a racket.
Just bums me out, man.
Yep.
Just bumming me
This
out.
is the feelings part of the podcast where we say, we're kind of tired of talking about all this stuff.
Yeah.
Because the bottom line is I didn't get into this and you didn't get into this to talk about legal policies and who gets cut of what in big business. We got into this for enthusiasm about the products and about what people can do with the products and how we use them and how other people use them to make their lives better and have fun and all of those things. And none of this is that. I think there's value in understanding Apple's business. But like this, it's the summer of fun. Summer of fun.
This year has reminded me of 2020.
It's just rough.
In summer of 2020, there was no break in the news. It's kept going for the whole summer.
Yes. Yeah.
This year, there has been no break in the news. The news has just kept happening. Now, the thing about this is, it's kind of in between a rock and a hard place, right? This is, I think, interesting stuff that is happening.
Yeah.
to Apple. We cover Apple. We talk about Apple. Like, but it's also depressing. But like, I wouldn't want to just pretend it didn't exist. Right?
I
And we
know.
just carry on like it
Can't
didn't
do that.
exist. But I don't want to get lost in it either. So basically, what I've been like, what I've been thinking of, I think once we get through this period, like getting up to the iPhone, right? A couple of weeks for that. Potentially after the iPhone, I might readjust a little bit how much I'm putting in.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to ignore it. Like, so like this Patreon thing, would have spoke about it, right? But maybe
Yeah, you gotta
not
do
the
it.
Spotify thing, maybe not the Fortnite thing if I was
Well,
editing us down. But I
would
want to complete
say-
the threads of the stuff we started talking
Yeah.
about, you know?
Yeah, I think we need to talk about it, but and Lawyer Up, the artwork is beautiful and all that. I think we're going to continue talking about it, but I do think that there's a point at which we have to say, as the kind of curators of the content of the show, that it's too much.
Yeah.
And we don't want to do it. And I can say from personal experience, Stephen Hackett and I did a podcast called Download. And the
Yeah, I
year
know.
plus that we did it was the year where every single week was a terrible Facebook story about how Facebook had done another thing to ruin people's privacy and change election results and lead to potential genocides. And just, it was one terrible story after another, to the point where we added a segment called the Fuzzy Puppy Update because we were so depressed at the end of the segment.
Well, we have Rumor Roundup coming up next, and that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
You know?
And the number one reason we stopped doing Download is because it was dispiriting to cover that terrible stuff all the time. It's not what we got into this to do. And we didn't want to do it anymore. And we have had the luxury of just saying, let's just stop this.
Yeah.
And we're not going to stop covering the stuff on Upgrade, but I do feel like at some point we're going to need to recalibrate a little bit because it's a lot. There's a lot
it's
going on.
gonna happen.
And Apple's
It's going to happen.
and we can't not talk about stuff that's Apple's doing that we don't agree with or we think is bad, and we have to talk about it. But there's so much of it right now,
Yes.
and there's a limit to what we can do.
Well, it's like I said last week, right? And I've been thinking about it a lot. I think I said it on this show. I don't remember if I said it on the show. I'm going to say it again now anyway.
Okay,
There's like,
do it.
and Federico had a version of this himself too, where he said like the two apples. But like for me, it's just that I'm so happy the products are good. Yeah, because I was talking about the Mac malaise time, right? Like I'm so happy the products are
Oh,
good
man.
right now.
Imagine if the
because-
butterfly keyboard was out
Yes,
there now.
exactly. Imagine
Oh.
that, right? Like then it would be like I don't know what I would do. Like the products are good right now, and like the software is good right now, by and large. But like the products are good at least, and they're doing interesting stuff. So it at least gives some balance. And basically, it's just like going forward, we're still going to talk about this stuff, but I think I'm going to start like tapering some of these bits off a little bit, like, and just try and cover the biggest things. 'Cause I don't want to do this every week. And at this like, but it's like, look, but I don't want to let them off, right? Like this Patreon
That's
thing,
it.
we would have spoke about this no matter
It's
what.
so
'cause this is
it's
important.
so unnecessary.
Yeah.
It's so unnecessary. And I'm going to tell you, having spent decades now understanding Apple's mindset, I'm sure the mindset here is essentially, oh, Patreon hides behind their creators, but they're the one that's built a big business taking money from the creators. And we've let them sort of slide and not taken our cut, but they're taking advantage of us now, Patreon, the corporation, and we're not going to let them. We're going to put the screws to them. I guarantee you that's what they're thinking internally.
Yeah.
And let me say, Patreon is not without fault here. Patreon has chosen a path that they want to go with their business that makes it more than maybe the initial plans of Patreon. Patreon made changes to the terms that creators are unhappy with.
Mm-hmm.
Patreon is not without fault here at all. And I do think that part of the reason Apple does this is that Apple perceives Patreon as being a business that is trying to make a lot of money from creators while skating by Apple and giving Apple its cut. That said, this is an own goal on Apple's part because in the end, you make your policies and you could adjust them. And so the argument of like, well, but Apple had to do this because if they let Patreon slide, then somebody else is going to slide. The answer is no. Apple can make a new entitlement, a new system, a new business term. They can say, oh, if you're passing on something to an independent creator and you have a certain, like, they could build a whole little program around
They
it.
did it
Basically
for,
said,
for a different type of creator, the big Hollywood creators. They created reader apps for them.
yeah. So they could do it if they wanted. And maybe they will. Maybe this is phase one. But the fact is, like, they should not have done this just unilaterally like this. It makes them look really bad. And the fact that I think the most galling thing to me is that it's the 30%, even though these are all, so they don't even get the discount. They don't even get the half off. Even though each individual creator probably deserves it, because Patreon doesn't as a whole. And so they're going to put the screws to Patreon there. I do think in the end, that's probably what's going on here is Apple views Patreon as a competitor or as a business partner that is not giving Apple its fair share. I don't think they're thinking about the creators at all, which is obvious because if you thought about it, you wouldn't do this.
Mm-hmm.